Good morning, Michael.
Good morning.
How's it been?
Very, very well. Very well.
Great. So
Yeah.
what do you do at the Oliphant Museum?
Well, my role here is as curator. So I'm one of 3 curators on staff, and our ultimate goal really is to be caretakers of the collection. When we say caretakers, we mean in a physical sense, for sure, but we also mean in the sense of being able to interpret this material for audiences who come to visit us.
Okay, that's interesting. So when you get these objects, are you the ones who date them?
The collection is actually based on the collection of Prince Sadruddin Aga Khan, who is the uncle of the current Aga Khan. Prince Sadruddin died in 2004 and left his collection as the foundational collection for the museum. When we do receive objects, when we acquire objects additionally in the museum, yes, we certainly do the research and date them and provide all of the facts about those objects. But we knew so much about the collection already when it entered, when we opened the museum in 2014.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So as you know, we've come here specifically to study more about astronomy-related artifacts that you might have in your collection. So would you start us off with one and
Sure.
tell us more about it?
Absolutely.
In particular, the historical background, as well as how does that piece of work fit in and contribute towards modern astronomy?
Toward modern astronomy, great. Well, what we're looking at here is a manuscript. It's a book, and literally a manuscript means something that is handwritten. So it's a handwritten book that was produced in Iran in the 17th century, in the mid-17th century. However, the manuscript contains a text that was written in the 10th century by an astronomer, a scientist named Al-Sufi. Al-Sufi was a scientist. He was an observational astronomer, and what his goal was to observe the stars in the heavens and to calculate their positions in the sky based on old knowledge from ancient Greece, particularly from the works of Ptolemy, and to synthesize that, to link it up somehow with pre-Islamic Arabian knowledge of the stars. So there was a science or a study of the stars in pre-Islamic Arabia known as Anwa. So here we can see a copy of Al-Sufi's text, which is known as the Book of Fixed Stars. It was the text itself was written in Arabic in the 10th century, in the year 964. But it was copied many, many times and translated, in fact, many times. What we see in this particular manuscript are illustrations of a constellation that contain Arabic text near it that describe the stars, and then a Persian translation of Al-Sufi's text in the margins all around. That's the writing that you see all around. Now, you'll notice in this manuscript that each of the constellations, these are the fixed stars as opposed to the planets, which are unfixed. They move in the sky when we look at them. The fixed stars, these constellations, are shown in mirror image. You can see one on one end and one on the other. They're actually the same constellation, just oriented in opposite directions. And the reason for that is because Al-Sufi wanted he wanted his text to be a teaching tool. He wanted people to look up at the sky and see the constellations and be able to correlate it to the manuscript. At the same time that people were looking at the stars, one of the tools that they used a long time ago was something called the celestial globe, which we have an example here. It's like a globe, like we would normally be familiar with, but instead of showing the land masses of the Earth and the oceans on the surface, what it is the constellations and other heavenly bodies in the sky taken out and then wrapped around a globe form. So basically it's a mirror image of what we see in the sky. So this way, illustrated copies of Sufi's text show both what we see in the sky and what you would see on a celestial globe, the mirror image. That way it's much easier to study and make the direct correlations between the tool that you use and what you actually see in the sky. there was just a general interest in the stars and in the heavenly bodies, and really in the scientific knowledge that was initially developed in other parts of the world, like ancient Greece, ancient India, and so forth. There was a general interest in the Islamic world at this time in taking that knowledge, translating it into Arabic, and assimilating it, making it part of the broader field of knowledge that this part of the world had. And it was with this old knowledge that's then assimilated. Another thing that Al-Sufi did is recalculate and discover new stars. So he recalculated the positions, he discovered new stars. There was a lot of new scientific knowledge that came with his study of old texts and with the development of his own text on the fixed stars. So this is part of a broader movement at the time known as the Translation Movement, which was sponsored by the Abbasid Caliphate, to translate knowledge from other parts of the world, assimilate it into the Islamic world, and then to use that as a building block to keep building more and more and more knowledge. So for our contemporary day, what's important about this manuscript is it's one of the earliest examples of true observational astronomy. It shows an impulse to getting it right, not just sort of looking at pictures of forms in the sky. It was really about scientific knowledge. And it's something that the text was copied again and again, translated into Latin. It was really the basis of astronomical knowledge for centuries. And it's with this text that we really have the development, the building blocks of modern astronomy.
Wow, that's wonderful.
Okay.
So did Al-Sufi also invent some instruments to do this, other than the one that you just mentioned?
He was an inventor, but he was also very interested in a tool known as the astrolabe. And we're going to look at an astrolabe in a moment. An astrolabe is, again, a development of the ancient Greek world and of ancient Greek knowledge, but it was really perfected under Muslim scientists. Al-Sufi wrote a treatise on the astrolabe and describes over 1,000 uses of this instrument, how it can be used. So let's have a look at an astrolabe in the collection.
So Michael, you were telling us about astrolabe, and I guess we have one right on hand.
We have one right on hand. We have a very important astrolabe right on hand. So an astrolabe is this instrument, a very elaborate instrument that is of flattened shape and has various dials and discs attached to the surface. And the purpose of these instruments is to be able to hold them up. There's a ring at the top that you can hold up and position the dials that have indicators. Position the dials in a way that you can align them with what you see in the sky and therefore understand where your location is on Earth. So it's a really interesting calculating tool. It was developed in ancient Greece as a sort of tool, but really it became very important in the Islamic world because of the need to understand two things. One, navigation by sea, and also navigation across land, since there was so much mercantile activity from the inception of Islam all the way through even the present day. But before having GPS locators on our phone, we needed to use other rudimentary instruments, and here we have a very beautiful example. The other was to determine one's location so that one could perform ritual prayers at the right time of day, in the right direction, praying toward Qibla, and so on. And so this tool could be used in that regard. If you're, let's say, in the middle of the sea, or you're in the middle of the desert, or in the middle of the mountains, and you have nothing to indicate where you are, this would help determine all sorts of ritual times that were significant for the practice of the faith. And so we have very elaborate instruments of these astrolabes that are developed. They often contain a series of discs inside of them, so you can actually unscrew the indicators on the surface and use the different discs depending on roughly where you are in the world. And this astrolabe, which was produced in Spain in the 14th century, this astrolabe contains 4 discs, and one is a disc that tells you your location in Nantes, France. One is in, I believe, in Toledo in Spain, one is Jerusalem, and one is Algiers. And so it actually correlates to the stars. Each of these discs correlates to the stars in these particular locations. Now, what's very interesting about this particular example is that it contains inscriptions both in Arabic and in Latin. which suggests that at some point in its history, it would have been owned by probably a Christian Latin, someone who would have known Latin, probably a Christian patron, as well as probably a Muslim patron. We know that Spain in this period was a multi-confessional, multi-ethnic society, and so this object itself really encapsulates that. Another very interesting thing is that on the dial that's correlated to Algiers, which is in Algeria, there are additional inscriptions in Hebrew, which suggests that probably the ultimate owner of this object was Jewish. And not only that, but a Jewish person who would have fled Spain after what's called the Reconquista, the expulsion of Muslims and Jews from Spain in the 15th century. Many Jews ended up moving to North Africa and specifically to Algiers. And so it seems as though this object would have been owned by a member of that particular community. So it's a very interesting object that tells so many human stories, as well as this great scientific story of astronomical knowledge and its development in the Muslim world during the medieval and early modern periods.
So yes, Michael, we've come to our final artifact for today. And you just mentioned that it's your favorite. Any particular reason?
It's my favorite because I think it tells such an interesting story of how science and poetic sensibility and really a human sensibility all sort of come together. What we have here is a 13th century jug. This is something that someone would have been drinking from, produced in Iraq, in the northern regions of Iraq. And as you can see, it's a rather luxurious object. The way that it's actually made is it has a copper alloy substrate, so bronze or brass, and then the surface is actually engraved with a very fine tool, and then little hatch marks are made underneath. And then very thin sheets of precious metal, gold, copper, and silver are inlaid, cut to fit, and inlaid and stuck onto the surface. The grooves help keep it in place after it's polished at the final stage. And so you have this really painstaking process to make this really gorgeous object with all of its intricacy and so on. Now, there are inscriptions in Arabic. There are really interesting inscriptions at the very top band around the neck that actually have Arabic writing that that ends at the top in human heads, which is very interesting. It's a kind of calligraphy known as anthropomorphizing calligraphy. But in this main central band, down toward, let's call it the belly of the jug, you have these polylobed cartouches all around, and there are 12 of them. And inside these 12 cartouches, you have depictions of the zodiacs and their correlated planets. And it's very interesting because what we have here is basically an astrological work. But what it reminds us is that astrology and astronomy were very closely related. They were both considered sciences at the time. Now, astrology is a bit different because it's less about calculating the position of the stars or mathematics, and it's more about the science of how the planets relate to our lives on Earth. There was a belief in the medieval period the planets controlled our lives, and this was considered scientific knowledge. It's very much the same as what we think about modern astrology when we go to the newspaper and read astrology, the astrology section. So this is essentially considered a science at the time. Each of the planets, each of the constellations, or I should say each of the zodiacal signs has a sort of relationship and controls a certain element of our lives here on Earth. So with that idea in mind, we have a map of the whole cosmos through the zodiacal signs, the full range of zodiacal signs. And you can imagine a very wealthy owner, this is a very extravagant object, probably a ruler, holding this in his hand and thinking to himself that he possesses the cosmos, that he can control the cosmos. And so that's a very poetic notion that is very much embedded in the thinking of medieval the eastern part of the Islamic world at the time. This idea of a cosmic rulership. That is, in essence, what is being expressed with this particular object. So it's a very interesting way of how observation of the sky, of the heavenly bodies, can sort of filter down into these very interesting notions about what it means to be a ruler, what it means to be human on Earth. I love this jug for that particular reason.
So you said there is an Arabic inscription.
Yes.
Does that have any meaning to it?
Often what we have are inscriptions on objects like this that are do'as, they're prayers, and they're usually benedictory blessings upon the owner, upon the ruler. And that's what we see in this example. Things like peace and fortune and prosperity and blessings and long life and everlasting health and so on. You see that repeated again and again around the in the inscriptions on these kinds of objects.
Well, would you know that if this particular one comes from the Holy Quran or not?
Comes from the?
Holy Quran or not?
No, these were not inscribed with Quranic inscriptions. Generally not. Generally not. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.